All right, so this is a video covering the material for the Indigenous Languages module of Linguistics 102. This is a fascinating and really rich area of that we can study, and we're really only going to be able to touch on it in this this module of this introductory course. But anyway, let's get into it. As usual, this video is going to follow through the learning outcomes document from the class, so you can follow along there if you like. The first section talks about an ethno-linguistic overview, so it's sort of a let's see what the state is in terms of speakers and how we classify the different languages, how they might group, that kind of thing. The genetic classification, this is really interesting. The history of linguistics, there's a lot of focus on European languages when we look at genetic classification, and these have been, for the most part, written down for centuries, and so when we do the historical reconstruction, we have a lot of written record. We don't just have to work with the spoken languages as they exist now, but for Indigenous languages of Canada, that's not the case, right? Most of these languages have no written record prior to frankly, settler colonial imposition of a written record as part of the settling, the religious conversion, and all of the stuff that goes along with that. But that's fine. We'll learn in the historical linguistics section that there's a lot of methods we can use based on just how languages are spoken now to compare them, and so a lot of work has been done grouping Indigenous languages into different families and even larger families of families, what's called macrofamilies or phyla or superstocks in the textbook. Just bigger groupings. I tend to just call them families, nested families. Even to the extent some people claim an Amerindian proto-language, a language that was shared across these populations back in the original migrations into North America. The linguistic evidence for this is not great and is not widely accepted, but it's worth being aware of it. And yeah, so there's that. After we talk about briefly about genetic classification, we start going through kind of an inventory of the languages. There's a nice picture, nice map in there, figure, what is that, 9.1, identifying a distribution of different languages. Algonquin languages actually have quite a wide geographic spread, Athabascan languages in the northwest, and so on and so on. And we go through and look at, what are some of the main Algonquin languages in Canada, Cree being the most populous in terms of communities and also speakers, with a lot of variety. This is one that's spread well across the Canadian prairies and into eastern Canada and towards the northwest. The Inuit languages, in previous editions of the textbook, these have been called Eskimo-Aleut languages, so that's the connection there. If you're using a previous version, the Dene, Na-Dene languages, a lot of those spoken, Siouan languages, Salish languages, and in each of these, Tsimshianic, Iroquoian, Wakashan, in each of these we get example languages, approximate population, and those population numbers get updated from edition to edition of the textbook. What I have in the learning outcomes is currently the 9th edition, the most contemporary. You don't have to memorize the numbers. That's not the key about this. Although it is worth knowing in general the approximate sort of, order of magnitude of the numbers, which types of, which family, which specific languages have the most speakers, which ones are smaller populations. We have some isolates. The main contact language among the Indigenous languages is Michif, the language of the Métis. Contact between Cree and Ojibwe and French. Cree and Ojibwe, you'll see, are both Algonquin languages, so they share a lot of properties. Yeah, so we get this broad overview of the different languages. We find out where they're spoken, how many, that kind of thing. So it's good to get your head into that. Because I test in an open book format, you won't have to memorize, but at least you'll know where to find these things. Then there's two sort of balanced sections, one on the decline of Indigenous languages, followed by a section on reclamation of Indigenous languages in Canada. So decline of these languages, I mean, languages are always fading out and being replaced and whatnot throughout human existence, but it's been especially marked since Europeans have arrived in North America, especially at first, but even today, their approach to Indigenous languages is generally one that tends to cause decline in those languages in terms of numbers of speakers and scope of how they're spoke, how they're used. So we learn a little bit about that, and then we learn some very encouraging stories of reclamation and how communities of speakers can cause their language to sort of hold on and even expand, be spoken by more people, and how we might notice that. So that's worth catching. After that, we get into structural features, right? So this is a linguistic analysis course. It's worth knowing, what are the linguistic properties of these different languages? So we go through in order, starting with phonology, and look at some consonant systems, some vowel systems. There isn't a phonological property or any other property that is characteristic of all Indigenous languages in Canada, because, as we just learned, they're from a lot of different languages, right? They represent different languages, different language families, and so they have widely varying properties. It's quite a rich source of linguistic diversity and delight in these different languages. So that's worth worth noticing and appreciating and understanding a little bit. Morphologically, we look at there's some languages that really beautifully illustrate polysynthesis, which is a rare kind of especially long concatenative kind of morphological property of languages. Different person and number systems than what we're used to with what we might be used to with European languages. Gender. European languages tend to have a masculine, feminine, and sometimes neuter type of gender system, dividing into the nouns into different categories. So what gender is just dividing nouns into categories. Indigenous languages sometimes do that. Sometimes they do a more animate, inanimate. Those are also categories, and so, for example, Cree has those two genders that affect which verbs you use and various other aspects of the grammar. Syntactic structures, again, word order, as language, verb initial, verb final, and some other things about the syntactic structure that you might find in Indigenous languages. And that's actually how the chapter ends. It just ends with the sort of looking through some aspects of the structure of languages. You could call this a case study in what we've just looked at in terms of classification of languages. You could call it a slightly deeper dive, and we'll be getting into this in the material for this class. Slightly deeper dive in the general kind of territorial acknowledgement, right? I'm recording this video, I'm teaching this material from on Treaty 6 territory in Canada, and this is land that was held and stewarded, you could say, by Indigenous peoples for thousands and thousands of years before my farmer ancestors arrived to take possession of it. I like, we can think of the heritage of place, right? The heritage of this place that I am at and that you may be at. These are the kinds of languages. These are the languages that have been part of that heritage, where people have interacted for thousands and thousands of years, and those interactions shape, any interaction that people have where they're using language, the interactions shape the language shapes the interactions. So the human past of this place is immersed in these languages that we have a chance to learn something about here, and we'll have more chances to learn about them in the following modules, because anything we learn about language can be applied to any language, right? And I think it's worth knowing that there are, for example, Cree communities in and around Edmonton. There are Nakota communities not far from Edmonton. There are communities of other languages that we cover in this chapter in Edmonton, around Alberta, and of course across Canada. And these are real things. This isn't history. This is the world that we live in, and it's worth making those connections. So anyway, that's the overview of this module for now, and you can see eClass for more information about what you need to know there, and what we're going to do with this knowledge in this module. That's all for now.